The morning sun cast long shadows across Harold Matthews' perfectly trimmed front lawn as he slowly made his way to his favorite wooden rocking chair on the porch. At 93 years old, his morning routine had remained unchanged for the past 20 years since his beloved wife, Martha, had passed away. His weathered hands carefully carried a steaming cup of black coffee, the same way he had enjoyed it during his military days. Harold's small corner house on Maple Street had been his home for over 50 years. The red brick building, with its white trim and emerald green shutters, stood as a testament to time well spent. His pride and joy, a garden full of red and pink roses, lined the white picket fence that surrounded his property. Martha had planted the first rose bush, and Harold had promised her on her deathbed that he would keep their garden blooming. The neighborhood had always been peaceful. Most of the residents were families or retirees who appreciated the quiet suburban lifestyle. Children would wave at Harold as they passed by on their bikes, and neighbors would often stop to admire his roses or bring him homemade pies. Some even called him Grandpa Harold, a nickname that always brought a warm smile to his face. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Harold would sit on his porch wearing his old military cap, decorated with pins from his service in World War II. Young couples walking their dogs would stop to chat, and he would share stories about his time as a military intelligence officer. He never bragged about his medals or achievements. Instead, he spoke about the friendships he had formed and the lessons he had learned about strategy and patience. Life had settled into a comfortable rhythm for Harold. His mornings started with tending to his roses, followed by coffee on the porch. Afternoons were spent reading military history books or solving complex puzzle games to keep his mind sharp. Sometimes, he would write letters to his grandchildren who lived in different states, telling them stories about their grandmother and his adventures during the war. But everything changed on a sunny Monday morning in April. Harold was pruning his favorite red rose bush when he heard it, the distant rumble of motorcycle engines. At first, it was just a faint noise, but it grew louder and louder until it felt like thunder rolling down the street. Looking up from his gardening, he saw a group of motorcycles heading toward the old Wilson warehouse 2 blocks away. The bikes were gleaming machines of chrome and steel, their riders dressed in black leather jackets with patches and logos Harold couldn't quite make out. There must have been at least 15 of them, each bike louder than the last. They turned into the warehouse property, which had been empty for the past 3 years. Later that day, Harold learned from Mrs. Thompson next door that a motorcycle club had bought the warehouse. They planned to turn it into their clubhouse, complete with a repair shop and meeting space. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood, causing concern among the residents who valued their quiet community. That first day marked the end of Harold's peaceful mornings. The roar of motorcycles became a constant backdrop to his daily routine. His hands would shake slightly as he tried to pour his coffee, the vibrations from the engines making the task more difficult than it already was for his arthritic fingers. The birds that used to sing in his rose garden became scarce, frightened away by the constant noise. Harold watched from his porch as more bikes arrived each day. The riders seemed to get younger and more careless, some popping wheelies right in front of his house or revving their engines unnecessarily. A few of his roses began to wilt, affected by the oil and exhaust fumes that now filled the air. As he sat in his rocking chair that evening, Harold's military-trained mind began to analyze the situation. He had faced bigger challenges during the war, situations that required careful planning and strategic thinking. His body might be old, but his mind was still sharp as ever. Something needed to be done, but confrontation wasn't the answer. He had learned long ago that the best victories came from careful strategy and patience. Looking at the photo of Martha on the small table beside him, Harold smiled quietly. "Well, my dear," he whispered, "looks like I've got one more mission to plan." His fingers unconsciously touched the intelligence medal pinned to his cap as he began to think, remembering the skills that had once helped him outsmart much more dangerous enemies than a group of noisy bikers. After a week of constant noise, Harold decided it was time to have a polite conversation with the bikers. He put on his best navy blue sweater, the one Martha had given him for their last anniversary, and his well-polished brown shoes. Taking his wooden walking cane for support, he slowly made his way down the 2 blocks to the warehouse. The old warehouse had changed drastically in just a week. The bikers had painted their club logo on the front wall, a fierce-looking eagle with red eyes. Music blasted from inside, and the smell of motor oil and cigarette smoke filled the air. 5 motorcycles were parked outside, their chrome surfaces gleaming in the afternoon sun. As Harold approached the entrance, he could hear loud laughter and the clinking of tools coming from inside. His military training kicked in automatically. He counted 4 distinct voices and noted 2 possible exits. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the heavy metal door with his cane. The door swung open, revealing a massive man with tattoos covering both arms. He stood at least 6 feet tall and had a thick black beard streaked with gray. A patch on his leather vest read, "Tank, President." Behind him, 3 other bikers stopped what they were doing to stare at the elderly visitor. "Well, what do we have here?" Tank's deep voice boomed through the doorway. "You lost, old-timer?" Harold stood straight, despite his aching back. "Good afternoon, young man," he said clearly, his voice steady. "I'm Harold Matthews. I live in the corner house with the rose garden." He pointed with his cane in the direction of his home. "I was hoping we could have a friendly discussion about the noise level." The bikers exchanged amused looks. One of them, a younger man with a red bandana, snickered and whispered something to his friend. Tank's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "A friendly discussion, huh?" Tank stepped closer to Harold. "Listen here, Gramps. We bought this property fair and square. We ain't breaking any laws, and we ain't changing how we do things because some old man can't handle a little bike noise." Harold remained calm, remembering tenser situations he handled during the war. "I understand this is your property," he said. "I'm just asking if we could find a middle ground. Many families in the neighborhood have young children, and there are several other retired." "Middle ground?" Tank interrupted with a laugh. "Boys, you hear this? The old-timer wants us to find middle ground." The other bikers joined in the laughter. "Look, Grandpa, maybe it's time for you to find a nice retirement home. This neighborhood ain't what it used to be." As if to emphasize Tank's point, one of the bikers revved his motorcycle engine, the sudden noise making Harold's ears ring. His hands trembled slightly, but he kept his dignity, standing straight and looking Tank directly in the eyes. "I've lived here for 50 years, Harold said quietly. "I fought in World War II, so people could live freely in their homes without fear or disturbance." Tank's expression hardened. "Well, times change, old man, and let me give you some friendly advice. Don't come around here again. We ain't known for our patience with complaints." He moved closer, towering over Harold. "And those pretty roses of yours? Be ashamed if something happened to them." The threat was clear. Harold tightened his grip on his cane, but kept his face neutral. His military training had taught him to never show fear or anger in front of an opponent. Without another word, he turned and began his slow walk home. Behind him, you could hear the bikers laughing. One of them started their motorcycle and drove circles around Harold as he walked, the engine roaring loudly next to his ears. By the time he reached his house, his legs were shaking from both the walk and the confrontation. Sitting in his favorite chair, Harold looked at the framed medals on his wall, particularly the one for military intelligence. The bikers had made a crucial mistake. They assumed he was just a weak old man. They didn't know they were dealing with someone who had outsmarted Nazi intelligence officers. They had no idea that behind his frail exterior lay the mind of a strategic master. Harold picked up a notebook and pen from his side table. "Time for Plan B," he muttered to himself, beginning to write. The bikers had chosen the wrong veteran to bully, and soon they would learn exactly why. That evening, Harold went down to his basement for the first time in months. Using his old brass key, he unlocked a dusty trunk that held memories from his military days. Inside, beneath his neatly folded uniform, lay a leather case containing papers from his time in military intelligence. His hands might shake when holding his coffee cup now, but his mind was as sharp as ever. Harold pulled out his old military field notebook and began to study his past mission notes. During the war, he had been known for gathering intelligence and using his enemies' own actions against them. "Know your opponent," he whispered to himself, remembering his training. "Find their patterns, their weaknesses, and their mistakes." The next morning, Harold woke up earlier than usual. He set up his old wooden desk near the front window, giving him a clear view of the street. From his daughter's last Christmas gift, a smartphone, he ordered a professional sound meter and 2 small security cameras. Though technology had changed since his military days, the principles of surveillance remained the same. While waiting for his equipment to arrive, Harold started keeping detailed notes. He wrote down when the bikers arrived each day, which routes they took, and how many members visited the club. He noticed that Tank usually arrived at 10 a.m. and left after midnight. The loudest periods were between 2 p.m. and 7 p.m. when they tested repaired motorcycles. 3 days later, the packages arrived. Harold's neighbor's grandson, Tommy, helped him set up the security cameras, one pointing at his rose garden and another covering the street. The bright 14-year-old boy was excited to help, especially when Harold shared a few war stories while they worked. "Mr. Matthews," Tommy asked while mounting the second camera, "why don't you just call the police about the bikers?" Harold smiled, remembering similar questions from young soldiers during the war. "Sometimes, Tommy, the direct approach isn't the best one. In the war, we learned that understanding your opponent was more powerful than confronting them." With his surveillance system in place, Harold began gathering evidence. The sound meter showed that the noise levels often reached 95 decibels, far above the legal limit. His cameras caught bikers deliberately circling his house late at night, and sometimes they would speed past his roses, letting their bikes blow exhaust fumes into his garden. But Harold noticed something else interesting. Through his window, he saw that the bikers were doing more than just repairs in the warehouse. Late at night, trucks would arrive, and boxes would be quickly unloaded. He carefully wrote down license plate numbers and timing patterns. Using his new smartphone, Harold learned how to take videos and photos. He recorded the bikers breaking noise ordinances, drinking in public, and harassing other neighbors. Each piece of evidence was carefully dated and organized in a filing system similar to what he had used during his intelligence days. One afternoon, while reviewing his notes, Harold noticed something crucial. The bikers were creatures of habit, just like his wartime opponents had been. They had specific patterns, regular meetings, and predictable behaviors. More importantly, they were careless, thinking no one was watching them. Harold pulled out a large map of the neighborhood from his military trunk. Using colored pins, he marked the bikers' regular routes, their parking spots, and the locations where they caused the most disturbance. He added notes about local laws they were breaking and the times when they were most vulnerable to official inspection. As he worked, Harold felt more energized than he had in years. His hands might shake when holding his coffee cup, but they were steady as he wrote his notes and placed his pins. The bikers had assumed he was just a weak old man who would give up after being intimidated. They didn't realize they were being studied by someone who had helped plan operations that defeated much more dangerous enemies. Looking at the photo of his late wife Martha, Harold smiled. "They think age has made me weak," he said to her picture, "but they forget that age also brings wisdom and patience." He picked up his phone and started scrolling through his collected evidence. It was time to move to the next phase of his plan, one that would teach these bikers a lesson they wouldn't forget. Harold knew from his military experience that no major operation succeeds alone. Just as he had worked with resistance networks during World War II, he needed to build a network of allies in his neighborhood. His first step was to invite his next-door neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, for coffee and cookies. On a quiet Tuesday morning, Mrs. Thompson sat in Harold's living room, surprised to smell freshly baked cookies. "Harold Matthews," she said with a smile, "I didn't know you could bake." Harold placed a plate of chocolate chip cookies on the coffee table. "Martha taught me before she passed," he explained, his voice soft with memory. "She said a man should know how to make at least one thing well." The cookies weren't perfect like Martha's, but they were good enough to make Mrs. Thompson take a second one. As they talked, Harold learned that Mrs. Thompson's grandchildren no longer visited because of the motorcycle noise. She was also worried about her small dog, who had become nervous and scared. Similar stories, Harold suspected, were hiding behind every door in the neighborhood. Over the next week, Harold invited more neighbors for cookies and coffee. He met with Mr. Garcia, whose automotive repair shop was losing customers because the bikers were offering illegal repair services. The Wilson family came with their 2 small children, who couldn't nap because of the constant noise. Even grumpy old Mr. Peterson from across the street showed up, complaining about his damaged flower beds from motorcycles cutting across his lawn. Harold's living room became a meeting place for concerned neighbors. He set up regular gatherings every Wednesday afternoon, serving his cookies and listening to everyone's stories. His military training had taught him that information was power, and each neighbor brought new pieces to the puzzle. Sarah Chin, a young lawyer who had recently moved to the neighborhood, proved to be a valuable ally. These noise levels are definitely illegal, she said, looking at Harold's sound meter readings. And if they're running an unlicensed repair shop, that's another violation. The retired police officer, Jack Murphy, who lived 3 houses down, offered his own insights. I've seen similar operations before, he said, studying Harold's notes about the late-night deliveries. Something's not right about those midnight truck deliveries. Harold organized the group carefully, just as he had managed intelligence networks during the war. Each neighbor had a role to play. Mrs. Thompson and her friends would document every incident of harassment. The Wilson children's father, a computer programmer, helped Harold set up a shared online folder for everyone's photos and videos. They created a phone tree system, alerting each other when the bikers were being particularly disruptive. Even Tommy, the teenager who had helped with the cameras, got his friends involved in recording the bikers' violations using their phones. 1 month into their operation, Harold's living room wall looked like a military command center. Maps marked with pins showed problem areas, calendars tracked incident patterns, and folders full of evidence were neatly stacked on his desk. But more importantly, the neighbors had found their courage by working together. "You've given us hope, Harold," Mrs. Thompson said during one meeting, patting his hand. "We were all too scared to do anything alone, but together?" She gestured at the room full of determined neighbors. Harold smiled, remembering similar moments of unity during the war. "In my military days," he told the group, "we learned that the strongest weapon against any enemy is a united community. The bikers think they're dealing with scared individuals, but they're actually facing an organized neighborhood." As the meeting ended and his neighbors left, each carrying a few cookies wrapped in napkins, Harold looked at his wall of evidence. The bikers had unknowingly helped create something powerful, a neighborhood that was no longer afraid to stand together. That evening, Harold added a new note to his planning book. Phase 1. Alliance building. Complete. He looked at Martha's photo and smiled. The cookies worked, just like you said they would, dear. Now it was time for Phase 2, and Harold knew exactly what to do next. With his neighborhood alliance firmly in place, Harold began the next phase of his plan. He sat at his desk early one morning, spreading out his collected evidence and strategic notes. His old military training manual lay open beside him, reminding him of an important lesson. The key to victory is not strength, but smart preparation. Harold started by creating detailed maps of the bikers' activities. Every piece of information his neighbors had gathered went into his analysis. He noticed that Tank and his group had 3 main weak points: their illegal repair shop, their violation of noise laws, and those mysterious late-night deliveries. Using his smartphone, Harold created a group chat for the neighbors. Mrs. Thompson had taught him how to use WhatsApp, and now he could coordinate with everyone easily. "Remember," he typed to the group, "document everything, but stay safe and don't let them notice you." The neighbors responded well to Harold's leadership. Jack Murphy, the retired police officer, used his old contacts to quietly check the license plates of the trucks making late-night deliveries. Sarah Chen, the lawyer, researched all the local business and zoning laws the bikers were breaking. Harold's military experience helped him spot patterns that others might miss. He noticed that Tank's group was most active on weekends, but their illegal repair work happened mostly on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. The late-night deliveries always came on Wednesdays, between 11 p.m. and midnight. In war, Harold explained to Tommy while they checked the security cameras, knowing your enemy's schedule is just as important as knowing their weapons. Tommy nodded seriously, helping Harold download and organize the video footage that showed the bikers breaking various laws. One important discovery came from Mr. Garcia, who owned the legitimate auto repair shop. He noticed that the bikers were dumping used oil and chemicals behind their warehouse. Harold asked him to take photos and soil samples, carefully documenting the environmental violations. Mrs. Wilson, a high school science teacher, borrowed equipment from her school to test the water running off from the bikers' property. The results showed dangerous levels of motor oil and other chemicals. Harold added these test results to his growing file of evidence. The neighborhood children also played their part, though Harold made sure they stayed safe. They used their phones to record the noise levels at different times of day, creating a detailed log of when the bikers were loudest. Their parents helped them measure the decibel levels, which often went far above legal limits. Harold organized all this information like he used to arrange intelligence reports during the war. Each violation was carefully documented, with multiple pieces of evidence to support it. He created backup copies of everything, storing them both digitally and in physical form. Never put all your evidence in one place, he told Sarah Chen as they organized the files. That's a lesson I learned the hard way in 1944. Sarah helped him create legal documents that organized the violations by category: noise ordinances, environmental laws, zoning regulations, and public safety concerns. As the evidence pile grew, Harold noticed something interesting. The bikers were getting careless, thinking no one would stand up to them. They became louder and more obvious with their illegal activities. This was exactly what Harold had been waiting for. Overconfidence is a weakness, he wrote in his notebook, remembering how this same flaw had helped him defeat enemy units during the war. Tank and his gang thought they had scared the neighborhood into submission, but they didn't realize they were being watched and documented every day. By the end of the month, Harold had compiled enough evidence to take action. His military training had taught him to be thorough, and now he had proof of at least 15 different legal violations. Each one was carefully documented, with photographs, videos, witness statements, and official measurements. Looking at Martha's photo, Harold smiled. "The pieces are in place, dear," he said quietly. "Now it's time to show these bullies that they picked the wrong neighborhood, and definitely the wrong veteran to mess with." Harold chose a quiet Monday morning to launch his carefully planned operation. He had learned in the war that timing was everything. Tank and most of his gang would be nursing their hangovers from Sunday's party, making them less likely to react quickly to what was about to happen. At exactly 9 a.m., Sarah Chen filed their legal complaints with the city council. At the same time, Jack Murphy's police contacts received anonymous tips about suspicious late-night deliveries at the warehouse. Mrs. Wilson submitted her water testing results to the Environmental Protection Agency, while Mr. Garcia sent his soil samples to the health department. Harold sat in his living room, directing operations like he used to do from military command posts. His phone buzzed constantly with updates from his neighbors. Tommy had set up a special group chat called Operation Quiet Street to help everyone stay coordinated. First wave of complaints filed, Sarah texted to the group. She had submitted thick folders of evidence showing how the bikers broke at least 15 different local laws. The noise violations alone filled 50 pages, complete with time-stamped recordings and decibel measurements. By 10 a.m., city inspectors were parking outside the bikers' warehouse. Harold watched through his window as Tank arrived, looking confused and angry at the official vehicles. The inspectors carried clipboards and wearing serious expressions as they approached the building. "Let me handle this," Tank shouted at his gang members, who were starting to gather around. But he wasn't prepared for what happened next. While he argued with the city inspectors about noise violations, environmental officials arrived to check the oil dumping situation. Mrs. Thompson, watching from her window, kept the group updated through their chat. "2 police cars just pulled up," she wrote. "Tank looks really worried now." Harold smiled, remembering how his military operations often succeeded by attacking from multiple directions at once. The bikers found themselves surrounded by various officials, each with different complaints to investigate. When Tank tried to intimidate the noise inspector, he discovered that the inspector had videos of their illegal late-night repairs. When he told another official to leave, he was shown photographs of their chemical dumping. By noon, the warehouse was filled with inspectors from different departments. They found violated safety codes, illegal modifications to the building, and evidence of unauthorized business operations. Each discovery led to more fines and violations. Harold had planned this like a military campaign. Every piece of evidence was clear and undeniable. The officials had everything they needed: photographs, videos, sound recordings, and witness statements. Tank and his gang couldn't deny or threaten their way out of this situation. "You should see their faces," Tommy texted to the group. He was watching from the safe distance of his upstairs window. "They look totally confused, like they don't know what hit them." Sarah Chen arrived at the warehouse with more legal papers. "These are cease and desist orders," she announced loudly, handing them to Tank. "You're operating an illegal business in a residential zone. The city has ordered you to stop all operations immediately." Tank's face turned red with anger. He looked around the street, trying to figure out who had organized this attack. His eyes stopped on Harold's house, where the old veteran sat calmly in his rocking chair on the porch, drinking his morning coffee. The biker leader started walking toward Harold's house, but two police officers stepped in his way. "Sir," one officer said firmly, "we have some questions about those late-night deliveries." Tank's face went pale as he realized just how much trouble he was in. By the end of the day, the warehouse was closed and sealed with official notices. The bikers stood in small groups, looking lost and angry. Their illegal repair shop was shut down, their late-night activities were under investigation, and they faced thousands of dollars in fines. Harold watched it all from his porch, sipping his coffee with a steady hand. In his military days, he had learned that the best victories came from careful planning and patience. The bikers had thought they were dealing with a weak old man, but they had actually faced a strategic master who knew exactly how to win without throwing a single punch. The day after the raid, Harold sat on his porch, enjoying the unusual quiet of the morning. His roses seemed to stand taller in the peaceful air. As he sipped his coffee, he noticed a single motorcycle approaching his house. It was Tank, riding alone and moving slowly, without the usual roar of his engine. Tank parked his bike at the curb and walked up to Harold's fence. He stood there for a moment, looking uncomfortable in the morning sun. Harold noticed that the biker wasn't wearing his usual leather jacket, but instead had on a plain black t-shirt that revealed something interesting, a military tattoo on his arm. "Mr. Matthews," Tank said, his voice quieter than usual, "may I speak with you for a moment?" The politeness in his tone surprised Harold, who nodded and gestured to the empty rocking chair beside him. Tank carefully climbed the porch steps and sat down. Up close, Harold could now clearly see the tattoo. It was the emblem of the 75th Ranger Regiment. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the morning birds singing around them. "One of my guys did some research on you last night," Tank finally said, looking at his hands. "Found out about your service record. World War II, military intelligence, Bronze Star, Purple Heart." He paused, then added softly, "My grandfather fought in that war." Harold studied the younger man's face. In the gentle morning light, without his gang around him, Tank looked different, younger and somehow less threatening. "Afghanistan?" Harold asked, nodding toward the tattoo. Tank nodded. 3 tours. Got out in 2018. He rubbed his face with his hands. Started the bike club to help some other vets deal with civilian life. But somewhere along the way, I lost track of what we were supposed to be. For the first time, Harold saw past the tough biker exterior. He recognized something in Tank's eyes, the same look he'd seen in young soldiers after the war, trying to find their place in a peaceful world. The midnight deliveries, Tank continued, looking ashamed. They were parts for the bikes. Some of them not exactly legal, but nothing worse than that. The repair shop was supposed to be a way to help vets learn a trade, but we got carried away, started acting like we owned the street. Harold reached for his coffee pot and poured a cup for Tank. The younger veteran accepted it gratefully. "In the war," Harold said, passing Tank some sugar, "I learned that the hardest battle isn't always with the enemy. Sometimes it's with ourselves, finding our way home." Tank took a sip of coffee, his hands slightly shaking. "We disrespected you, sir. Worse, we disrespected everything the uniform stands for. When I saw your war medals yesterday through your window, I felt..." He shook his head. "I felt like I betrayed something important." Mrs. Thompson came out of her house across the street, looking worried when she saw Tank. Harold waved to her, letting her know everything was fine. She nodded and went back inside, but Harold knew she'd be watching from her window. "The thing about mistakes," Harold said slowly, "is that they can be fixed. I watched you with your men. You're still a leader, son. They look up to you. Question is, where are you leading them?" Tank sat quietly for a long moment, drinking his coffee and looking at Harold's rose garden. "We've got some skills," he finally said. "Mechanical knowledge, strong backs. Maybe we could help around the neighborhood instead of terrorizing it." Harold smiled, remembering how many young soldiers he'd seen turn their lives around. "Mrs. Wilson's fence needs fixing," he suggested. "And Mr. Garcia could probably use some help at his legal repair shop. He's getting too old to handle the heavy work alone." Tank nodded, a small smile forming on his face. "And maybe we could keep the noise down. Do our testing at the old track outside town instead of on the streets." He looked at Harold's roses. "Those are beautiful flowers, sir. My mom used to grow roses." Harold saw something change in Tank's eyes, a spark of the man he must have been before, the soldier who had served his country with honor. Sometimes, Harold knew, the best victory isn't defeating your enemy, but helping them find their way back to who they really are. 3 months after Tank's morning visit to Harold's porch, the neighborhood had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. The old warehouse, once a source of noise and trouble, had been transformed into a proper motorcycle repair training center, complete with soundproofed walls and proper permits. On a bright Saturday morning, Harold sat in his favorite rocking chair, watching Tank and his men teaching a group of local teenagers about motorcycle maintenance. Tommy was among them, his face bright with excitement as he learned how to change oil properly. The bikers had become mentors, sharing their knowledge with the next generation. Mrs. Thompson walked over to Harold's porch, carrying a fresh apple pie. "Would you believe it?" she said, setting the pie on the small table between their chairs. "Tank and his friends fixed my fence yesterday. Wouldn't even take any money for it. Just asked for some of my lemonade." Harold smiled, watching as Tank demonstrated proper tool handling to the teenagers. The biker leader now wore a clean mechanic's shirt with Veterans Motorcycle Training Center embroidered on the back. The rest of his gang had similar shirts, looking more like professional instructors than the troublemakers they'd been just months ago. The neighborhood had healed in other ways too. Mr. Garcia's repair shop now partnered with the bikers, sending them overflow work and sharing equipment. The Wilson children played freely in their yard again, sometimes waving to the bikers who now kept their engines quiet in residential areas. Even grumpy Mr. Peterson had softened after Tank's group helped him build a new garden fence. Every Tuesday evening, Harold hosted what he called Veterans Coffee Hour on his porch. Tank and some of his men would join him, sharing stories about their service and helping each other deal with the challenges of civilian life. Sometimes, other veterans from the neighborhood would join them, creating a support network that stretched beyond generations. The mysterious late-night deliveries had been replaced by weekend charity rides. The bikers organized motorcycle rallies to raise money for veteran causes, always being careful to plan routes that wouldn't disturb residential areas. They had found a new purpose, using their love of motorcycles to help others. Harold's rose garden had unexpected new caretakers. Tank had mentioned his mother's roses during their first peaceful conversation, and now he and some of his men helped tend to Harold's garden. They had even planted new bushes, creating a memorial section for fallen veterans. "You know what's funny, Mr. Matthews?" Tank said one evening as they finished working in the garden. "We thought we were tough guys, breaking rules and making noise. But real strength, that's what you showed us, winning without throwing a punch, leading by example." Sarah Chen, the lawyer who had helped with the complaints, now provided free legal advice to veterans at the training center. Jack Murphy, the retired police officer, helped the bikers organize their charity rides. The neighborhood had become a true community, stronger because it had faced and overcome its challenges together. 1 year after the conflict began, the neighborhood organized a special celebration. They called it Community Unity Day, and it brought together everyone who had been part of the change. The bikers gave motorcycle maintenance demonstrations, Mrs. Thompson and other neighbors provided food, and children played safely in the streets. During the celebration, Tank stood up to make a speech. "A year ago, we thought we were taking over this neighborhood," he said, looking at Harold with respect. "Instead, this neighborhood, and especially this wise veteran here, helped us find ourselves again. Sometimes the best victories aren't won through force, but through wisdom and understanding." Harold sat in his rocking chair, watching the celebration with satisfaction. His military training had taught him about strategy and intelligence, but life had taught him about patience and compassion. Sometimes, the best way to defeat an enemy was to turn them into a friend. As the sun set on the celebration, Harold looked at Martha's photo on his side table. "You were right, dear," he whispered. "Sometimes the best garden isn't just the one you grow, it's the community you help build." Around him, the sound of laughter and friendly conversation filled the air, proving that even the toughest conflicts can have unexpected and beautiful resolutions.